Session 3, Kings, Prophets, and Exile. We last left off our covenant Manna people in the land that had been promised. They had become graduates of the wilderness school and moved to the land where they shared a covenant with God. So here we have the early struggles, trials, joys of the landed people. So let's begin. During the days of early Israel, God's partner people lived in relative equality. They avoided a sharp distinction between rich and poor, haves and have-nots. Except during periods of apostasy, they recognized Yahweh as their only ruler. They did, however, face a vexing problem. Neighboring people kept bothering them, pestering them, stealing from them, and attacking them. This situation led to a heated debate between people who wanted a king and people who did not want a king. Their arguments went like this. We need a king to protect us from our enemies. We must live in the real world. You need not fear. The king will not oppress us because the king will be one of us under God and the covenant. Please, I'm pleading with you for the sake of our national security and the safety of our children, we must have a king. If we have a king, we'll become like other nations, the other side said. We'll have military conscription. Elites will grab the land entrusted to our families. We will become like slaves. We'll have to do hard labor for the king and his big deals. The king will lay heavy tax burdens on us. We will cry out to God in our oppression. The pro-king realistic majority wanted a king like other nations, but the minority feared that with a king, the partner people would become like these nations, like the Egypt of their slavery. Yahweh and Samuel, a special friend of Yahweh, sided with the anti-king people. They were afraid that a king would cause the society to be divided between big deals and little deals, rich and poor. The pro-king people pushed so hard that Yahweh and Samuel finally gave in. They decided to work for a new possibility. A faithful people led by a faithful king, all committed to the way of righteousness and mercy. God and Samuel hoped it would work. Yahweh and Samuel picked Saul to serve as the first king. Under Saul, Israel did not turn into a divided society of rich and poor, big deals and little deals. However, Saul had so many problems being a king that Yahweh and Samuel decided to pick somebody else. They went to a man named Jesse and looked over his sons. Yahweh and Samuel passed over the big, handsome warrior-type sons and instead picked David, the little brother. Yahweh and Samuel anointed David king of Israel. King David was a good king. But then things turned bad. God's hope did not work out. When Solomon succeeded David, the worst fears of the anti-king people came true. Turning from the man away, Solomon and his elites gathered massive wealth for themselves. They imposed forced labor and heavy taxes, and God's partner people became a society of big deals and little deals, exploiters and exploited. Forsaking both righteousness and mercy, Solomon found glory in 700 wives and 300 concubines, in his palace, in his army, his piles of gold, silver, ivory, cedar, and fine clothes, and in his collection of apes and baboons. Yahweh wept, and all creation wept, because Israel had become what Israel had left, Pharaoh's Egypt. When Solomon died, things went from bad to worse. Because of Solomon's big deal ways and his unfair preference for the south over the north, the northern tribes split away and formed their own nation. Now God's partner people were divided into two rival nations, each with their own king. The south was called Judah and the north, Israel. The people of both Judah and Israel increasingly left their true partner and leader, the liberator God, and worshiped their manna piles and the God of their neighbors. These gods promised successful crops in exchange for correct ritual forms. More and more, the rich exploited the poor, practicing neither righteousness nor mercy. By bribery and cheating, the rich added house to house and field to field. They even began to think they earned and deserved and owned their land and riches. The old vision faded. Except for a small remnant, nobody loved Yahweh with heart and soul and strength. Few longed to live as Manna people, a Sabbath people, friends with God, friends with each other, and friends with nature. The majority spent their days grabbing, securing, and protecting their manna piles. The land was filled with avarice, distrust, loneliness, alienation, and covetousness. Some had too much, some had too little, and the society smelled foul. Did they continue to worship Yahweh? They certainly did, along with the gods of their neighbors, but they did not worship in order to incorporate themselves into the life of the liberator God. Instead, they performed correct religious actions as a way of trying to manipulate their deity into sending good fortune. Instead of seeing manna as a gift to sustain the joyful life of friendship, manna and the size of one's manna pile had now become the very reason for living. Yahweh remembered better times, the days of liberation from Egypt, the day of the covenant, the days in the wilderness, and the days when the people divided the land like manna and lived together as equal partners. God wept, and all creation wept. All hope was not lost. A small remnant still remembered God's covenant promise and longed for a society of righteousness and mercy. From their midst, God raised up special preachers called the prophets of Yahweh. They had names like Amos, Hosea, Micah, Isaiah, and Jeremiah. Through their words and dramatic actions, God pleaded with the people of Judah and Israel. Come back to me. Come back to your true friend and partner. Come back to the covenant gift. Come back to your mission, to your calling, to the lessons you learned in the wilderness. Come back to the joyful manna life. The prophets also told the people that their stupidity would lead to ruin. The big deals, upset by such negative thinking, tried their hardest to silence the prophets. But the prophets were right. The Assyrians destroyed Israel. The Babylonians destroyed Judah. God's people were led away from their homes in chains. By the waters of Babylon, the people wept. They hung up their harps because they could not sing Yahweh's song in such a strange land. God's love still burned for the exile people. God wanted to repeat the Exodus and set the people free. When the Persians defeated the Babylonians, the liberator God saw an opportunity for the second great Exodus. A remnant of the exiles went home. Yahweh again dared to dream that now this people would become a light to the nations. The exiles danced and laughed and sang on the highway from Babylon to Jerusalem. Their homecoming was bittersweet. Houses, farms, and the temple lay in ruins. The people felt like they had entered a new wilderness. Yahweh started a school. Where there's wilderness, there's a school. And the main lesson in this wilderness school? Mercy. Inspired by their teachers, the partner people worked hard to restore their devastated land. They fervently worshiped Yahweh. Elated at first, it was not long before God began to worry. Something started to happen which upset the one who loves all people. The leaders of the beloved people decided the Israelites had to be completely separated from foreigners if they were to live as God's special people. Marriages were broken, families torn apart. Yahweh cried with those whose lives were shattered. The partner people had chosen a narrow form of righteousness. They had forgotten about mercy. Yet God rejoiced because a small remnant refused to go along with the popular point of view. Through this simple minority, Yahweh spoke to the whole people in the form of simple and beautiful stories, like the story of Ruth. Through these stories, the small minority proclaimed God loves all people and wants everyone included in the realm of mercy. The post-exilic community lived in relative independence under Persian rule. Great change came when the Macedonians defeated the Persians. During the Great Persecution, God's faithful survived by telling faith stories to encourage one another, like Daniel in the lion's den. After a century of manna living, the priests became big deals and exploited the poor. A remnant of the partner people realized they had no power and no control over their future. Their only hope was to cry out to God in their helplessness, as the slaves had cried out in Egypt.